everyone, my name is Kat Savage and I'm a professional artist, clinical hypnotherapist and well-being expert working with those in the creative arts sector. In my line of work, I get to meet some amazing, colourful people, from actors to artists, people who live their lives by their own rules, fueled by passion and determination to bring their unique talents into the world. I wanted to discover what it took for people to leave the usual 9 to 5 and hop on a dream, to capture their bravest moments and share these meaningful conversations with you, so that together we can explore the ideas, emotions and moments that could potentially change our lives too. So let's keep talking, have some fun and enjoy the show. This week on the show, we speak to autism specialist, writer, radio host, poet and musician Jak Whitfield. Living with autism, Jak has spent a lifetime achieving what others might have considered out of his reach. Jak's beautiful mind also inhabits another persona, Jane, who up until recently he was told to suppress with psychosis medication. Making the brave decision to embrace all that Jak and Jane are together, Jane now lives a fully realised life and makes appearances on stage with the band The Spoils Collective and co-writes with Jak in his own music. In the final throes of a PhD in verbal-free communication in autistic children and with aspirations to become a community-centred lecturer and research practitioner, Jak is smashing the status quo left, right and centre. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the punk trumpeter himself, Jak Whitfield. Jak Whitfield, welcome to the Brave Moment.
Phenomenal to be here. Thank you so much.
Phenomenal. I like that. I hope that all of the guests feel that way. What have you been up to recently, my friend?
I mean, phenomenal is kind of fitting, I guess, because I'm currently in the throes of PhD study, and my current area is looking at I want to say verbal-free communication of autistic children, because we tend to use this term non-verbal, to describe autistic children who don't communicate verbally. But, as it happens, it's looking at the diversity of communication that you can have, when not using verbal communication, and looking beyond kind of a lot of very function-heavy communication that we try and have with autistic children, and kind of looking at the emotions and interest and joy that can come out of that communication, which is a bit of a mind-blowing process on a day-to-day basis.
That's really, really interesting. And I know you yourself are autistic, aren't you?
Yes.
So
yeah.
How are you learning about yourself in this process of looking at non-verbal autistic children?
I think it very much comes along the lines of when I started autism research proper, which was kind of between undergrad and postgrad. It was because I was starting to speak as an autistic person. Wasn't really that comfortable with it up until then. Since then, it's been very much a task of learning about all the parts of the spectrum that I'm not, and what I'd kind of say is my quote-unquote kind of separated but extended family of other people on the autistic spectrum. It's making me think about the ways that I don't communicate verbally in entirely new ways, and actually kind of almost making me want to abandon verbal communication entirely sometimes, because the way that these children communicate is absolutely incredible. It's so inspiring.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I know that shout out Isabel Hurley-Wheel if you're listening. I know that she has a non-verbal, well, I say non-verbal, but like you said, she's got an autistic son who communicates through sounds and expression, just expression. He does these amazing, incredible things like finds pennies and puts them into beautiful patterns and beautiful artwork as a result. And he'll communicate with her through body language and also through sounds, as opposed to actual, words and things like that. And watching their dialogue as you're saying, it's really inspiring to see the massive spectrum of communication that we have available to us that maybe, people that aren't neurodivergent don't get to access because they're a bit sort of complacent about how they communicate.
Yeah. And it's to me, it really shows the power of emotion in voice and thinking about vocal rather than verbal. Because, I think when we think about words, a lot of the time, the emotion can be put down to etymology, I would guess, like the meaning of the word itself. Whereas, when these children are communicating, and sometimes it's like echoing the sounds animals make, or, very what you might call kind of diegetic noises. So, kind of like water flowing in this sort of stuff. Or again, like you say, they might be using communication in film. They might have seen something on the television.
Talking of children, I want to take you back into your own childhood, and I'd love for you to describe what it was like growing up and maybe one of your favourite or most interesting childhood memories.
I suppose one of the defining moments of my childhood was around a really close friend of mine, my best friend, who remained my best friend for the whole of his life, Will. When we were between 7, 8, and 9, we were creating comics together. And I think this is particularly important to me in retrospect, because at the time, some of those social eccentricities, I guess, and some of the potentially more kind of extrovert, introvert swings I would have, Will was very much one of the key people, one of the vocal people who understood me and, would allow me to be myself around him kind of no matter what. So our friendship was fundamental for me. So, us kind of making these comics together was a real highlight. And, they were only, these kind of pithy little things. They were like A4 sheets of paper folded in half. He'd come up with like a story or concept. I'd scribble it down. Yeah. So, and I think that's it. That, for somebody who, struggled to kind of connect socially, even if I wasn't really aware of it at the time, being able to create these little pieces of work and make friends by saying, every Friday we're going to make these little comics and we can hand them out to everyone. And, people would kind of be like, oh, what's it going to be next week on those sort of thing. And I think without realizing it, that was the first time where, like a special, what's called a special interest. And, I hate that term, but, a very specific interest and a very specific creative thing that we were doing was helping form a point of social conversation.
Do you know what? It's so refreshing to hear that two children, essentially at the time, were able to find that creative expression between them without any prompting as well. That's something that you created between the two of you. You had your own world, as it were, at that point that maybe couldn't be penetrated by the conformity of what was expected of you in your education. I just wish that in school, that the creative arts, that self-expression, that way of communicating was, seen as like a top level priority as opposed to shoved into the back, or, the funding isn't quite there for it, or whatever. It's so crucially important. And again, we're talking a lot today about communication and the importance of different types of communication. Where do you think you would have been without that communication with Will?
So the people I had around me growing up, so Will, kind of one or two other friends that we had, handful of other friends that we had, and my family, who, bless them, have always been so kind of supportive and kind of open and tolerant to kind of different ways that I'm expressing myself. I think they probably are the difference between me being here at the moment, overlooking Plymouth from my university office, and me potentially being in a home or supported living setting. I don't think that's an exaggeration. My autonomy specifically has really come from, having just open people and people who kind of let you kind of flex the world around you a bit, rather than, the world pushing you into a box.
It wouldn't take much, would it, to just shift those barriers that are in place? Maybe barriers is the wrong word, but those are fine lines in place to incorporate and encompass far more than we're actually offering at the moment. And I really hope that through your research and things like that, that those barriers continue to be pushed a little bit further and further away and maybe disintegrate altogether, so that more people, like yourself, can be sat in university offices in whichever city they're in.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the joy of, especially in this current kind of postdoctoral study, but in study I've done before, where I've always tried to link something my master's as some sort of creative practice. And I think it's one of those kind of big cultural hypocrisies from my perspective anyway, from my lens, that, culturally we are in love with various points in time where the status quo was changed, whether it's a new genre of music coming in or somebody who defied the conventions of literature or, the voice at the time, and kind of really pushed away from that. There's a lot of medical model, and, kind of looking at the psychology and biology around autism. And, that stuff is relatively essential. But at the same time, I think integrating and incorporating arts into those kind of dialogues should be really what kind of takes us from kind of scripting things to people, to allowing people to, kind of take control of their communication and their needs, and really kind of communicate what's going to work to open up the world to them. I think growing in Plymouth, I wouldn't say growing up because I've only been here for about 10 years, but kind of certainly transforming in Plymouth, that the punk scene is kind of very much thriving here. And I think, because, it's really evident living in a city, it kind of really thrives on a kind of convention changing or convention defying genre. It kind of seems really evident to me that we should be looking at that and just kind of applying it to more avenues in life than we're allowing. Like changing the status quo shouldn't have to be recreational. It should be something that's kind of omnipresent.
Oh, that was a mic drop moment. I absolutely loved that.
Thank God we recorded that.
Yeah, brilliant. And also just from a creative perspective, I mean, the brave moment exists because it's all about breaking that status quo, however that applies to you in your life, however it makes you feel to jump ship from a normal, and I put that in quote marks, way of living to one that really suits you as a creative individual. Because human beings, we are so creative. We need to express, we need to unleash, we need to let go emotionally and primally, and just be who we are. And I do feel, on the back of what you've just said, that the status quo is positive in some ways, but so backward in other ways. And if we could just apply some of that creative spirit that we're denying people on a day-to-day basis, oh my goodness, what a different world we could live in. How much more imaginative, how much more free it would be. I want to talk to you a little bit about music, actually. You joined a band called the Spoils Collective, didn't you?
This is where actually what you were saying about normal is really important, because normal isn't just what we see around us, it's how we define normal in ourselves, and having the comfort and the freedom to change that as well, which is where the Spoils Collective have been absolutely, again, like a fundamental part of my life, but in an adult phase. When I went into secondary school, that was when my autism became really apparent. So thankfully, I had a lot of really welcoming friends who, again, were really patient with me. Shout out to Matt, Isla, Mike, and Alex. So they were my kind of friendship group at secondary school, and we've all had experiences of kind of different needs in one way or another. Obviously, for various for obvious reasons, I'm not going to go into their details. But that was when my autism was really apparent. So there was one point where almost my entire tutor group at school was bullying me. I was really easy to trigger. And for bullies, I was an easy job, essentially. And I didn't do myself any favors either, I should say. Kind of having a short fuse definitely didn't help. So I withdrew into myself quite a lot. And thankfully I had those friends to take me out the other end. But that did mean that I started creating imaginary friends, essentially, at one point. And that really exacerbated into one point, a full-blown psychosis. So to be very specific, my psychosis was internal voices with external delusions. So, and this actually became a really dangerous time almost for me to absorb things creatively, because they would just become part of my delusions. So things I watched on TV, lyrics I listened to in songs, whatever, they would all form this imaginary world around me.
Wow. That must have been absolutely frightening.
It kind of was and it wasn't. And, again, this is something that I've had to really change, or am changing about myself. I'm still guilty of it from time to time. I think this very much fed into this wanting this kind of hero complex that I had, because, I felt very powerless against these bullies. So I was inventing monsters in order to defeat them. So they were terrifying, yes, but I was my own worst enemy, essentially, because I was creating these things to defeat them that I was both terrified of, but kind of felt compelled to confront. But this is where Jane begins. So Jane is now who I'd call my alternate personality. She started as an internal voice who, again, it's difficult because I describe it as psychosis, because when I went into CAMS, and again, I don't blame them for this because they were going off what they saw, and none of us knew any better. But when I was diagnosed with CAMS, when I started being quite open about the fact I was hearing about these voices because of being how extrovert I was, they diagnosed that as psychosis. But now I understand it as something quite different. And I think Jane is the female part of my personality that in many ways has been trapped and suppressed. And I think part of that is my doing, kind of unconsciously at first, and then through fear in later life, when I kind of came out of the major part of my psychosis and I realized that what I was experiencing was fake. So I suppressed Jane a lot, even though that she was kind of part of that, but she wasn't. So yeah, that's something I've had to kind of deal with for a number of years. But even though the psychosis had gone, this aspect of Jane would keep coming back, and the more I suppressed her, the more damage it would do to me. It would just lead to me doing kind of very stupid, sometimes shameful things in my private life and that sort of thing, because there were these two kind of parts of me that were kind of being quite combative, because I was trying to suppress her when she just wanted to be able to kind of live and breathe. And I think this is where it's important to consider normal, because obviously I saw just Jack as normal and Jane as not. Joining the Spoils Collective and at the same time kind of really embracing the Pride scene in Plymouth as well was really important. And again, there's so many disclaimers to this, but obviously Jane isn't my transgender, non-binary aspect, I would say. I'm not exactly uncomfortable with being Jack. It's just that Jack on his own can't really function because I'm not just Jack anymore. And actually kind of being in a band where I'm really lucky to kind of be among a collective of poets who again are really open-minded, even like when they're performing music, it's kind of challenging conceptions, and I think I really needed that.
And it's about finding those spaces, isn't it, where we can explore our duality, because I do feel like everybody has different parts to their personality. It's just that maybe we don't have the confidence to express them, and maybe they don't present themselves in the same way as Jane presents herself to you. But, if we look at history, how people conduct themselves behind, I don't want to say behind people's backs, but they're different people maybe behind a certain door or in a certain dress than they are when they go to work or when they're at home with their family or when they're out with their friends. And it does seem like, we've all got these different parts that we are so needing to express in a safe space that, unfortunately, because we don't have those safe spaces created in society as much as we should, sometimes they get oppressed and abused, misused. Sometimes they present in a very extreme way. Sometimes people will end up, having a completely double life to their work and their family. And that sometimes comes out 20 years, 30 years into a relationship that they've had, a completely different life. I do see, and again, through my lens, I do see that the creative space, the creative community in general is far more encompassing and far more explorative of these different parts of humanity than maybe, like we've talked about before, the status quo or what's expected of us in our day-to-day, which just can't be maintained in a healthy way without creating some level of stress or strain on the emotional persona. It's really interesting, and I'm really glad that you've got your band and that space for Jane to come out and be herself and be expressive and be part of who you are.
Yeah, thank you. And I think safe space is kind of become kind of like an important theme within that, because I can be Jane in the band at the moment, but I think it's been a real wake-up call. And I don't think I was ever somebody like a friend of mine who was female came up to me and said, I don't feel safe in this space, or walking home, whatever. I wouldn't deny that, and if I could help, I would, because I guess at the very least, like, I've experienced bullying myself, and I know how horrible that is, and I can imagine how worse it must be if you're kind of constantly kind of potentially stalked or watched because of gender. But I think it properly sank in where I started being Jane on stage, and I was like, great, now potentially I can go out and be Jane in person and that sort of thing. But the first time I tried being Jane out in the open, the fear that sank in, it still kind of makes me shake a little bit now. And I think again, it just really took that to properly realize that it's not just the idea of, I need to walk home a little bit quicker, or I need somebody on the phone. It feels quite paralyzing. And again, I kind of, in some ways, I feel a little bit kind of guilty kind of having this kind of conversation, because, I've only had to experience this like once or twice. And it's actually kind of just made me take a step back and kind of encourage Jane into my life slowly. And, like, a lot of people just don't have that option. And, I think it's going to change the norms of my lyric writing as well, which I think is really important, because see, when I was a solo artist before and do the obscure, I was trying in kind of to perform music and write lyrics not necessarily about being autistic, but kind of the world looking through an autistic lens, and how everything can sometimes kind of seem abstract and weird, especially, what I was talking about before about kind of hypocrisies of things that happen, and kind of exploring that. And I think Jane is kind of delivering that wake-up call to me, that's saying, you've done that, great, but you can't just stay in that place anymore. And that's kind of where Jane almost kind of needs to be taking over more in that kind of that vehicle. Without jumping the gun a bit with the idea of the podcast, when I was thinking about Brave Moments, it kind of felt like it's understanding how my sense of self can't just be myself, and it can't just be my normalized idea of self, even within an autistic context. It's got to be kind of accepting these components and these kind of personalities within me, and kind of, not dominating my sense of self through one particular form.
Finding that internal balance must be quite challenging sometimes when you've got two very dominant voices.
Especially, because we are very different people, and I can completely empathize with people if they think, nah, you're making it up, because, I can understand how strange it must be to hear that. But it was even talking kind of about phenomena, and this was, kind of, I had this really bizarre sensation, kind of like one or two times into being Jane on stage, where I kind of became quite aware that despite me being autistic, that Jane isn't. But at the same time, because we're essentially sharing a brain, we're sharing like a body and a self, she's still in some ways governed by the limitation, not terrible word, she's still
characteristics
governed, thank you, by the characteristics of my autism. Jane could be much more of this someone else that she is, but she's still having to kind of play by the cognitive rules that I've been governed with. So yeah, that balance is quite tricky.
I'm very inspired actually by not only, your brave moment, as it were, but also that integration of another part of who you are essentially into your person. I'm feeling super inspired about that, because here I am listening to Jack on this particular podcast and thinking about Jane and thinking about the internal voices that we have every day. And I know that they're very different to how you experience Jane, but we always have that constant sort of inner dialogue with ourselves. And sometimes another part of that dialogue will win out over, the one that we would present in public per se. And it might, decide that today I'm going to, I don't know, binge eat all the food under the sun, and then tomorrow I might decide to go to the zoo. And those might be two things that I wouldn't, and again, I put this in quote marks, normally chase in my day-to-day life. But those internal dialogues, I mean, if we could have the opportunity, as you have, to take that other part of ourselves, that other internal person that we battle with, or we communicate with every day, and put them in front of us and see them and physically sort of give them life, as it were, I bet that would be super interesting for everyone listening, and probably a lot more healthy than trying to mute that internal conversation, than trying to deny that space for that voice, because it's a strong voice. And I know that in some places, from like a psychology point of view, they talk about like the two different types of brain, the mammalian brain versus, the brain that we use now, the rational brain, and how the mammalian brain will be very, very strong in its primal needs, whilst, the more rational, and again, I put that in quote marks, brain will have to have this debate almost all the time with with this other part of our brain. So I think on some weird level, it's relatable. It's just that we never talk about it. We never talk about these internal conversations. And, you know, listening to you, having the courage to bring that part of yourself out into the open and give her the space to be a fully realized persona, to have a backstory, to really embrace and cherish that part of yourself and let her live. I think that's incredibly encouraging and incredibly motivating and inspiring for those of us who do have those internal conversations that maybe we don't talk about, and we just present ourselves as, you know, and again, quote marked, normal people.
And I kind of want to bring it back to what kind of saying it right at the top of the podcast about kind of the verbal free communication, and you know, sometimes wanting to liberate myself from verbal stuff. Yeah, I guess you already know where I'm going with this, but you know, I'm part of my liberating of, you know, the kind of the voice that isn't usually public, I guess, is through Jane. And I think it's important not to kind of browbeat that kind of liberation of communication too much, because I can see there'd be a temptation to think, you know, these ideas around kind of freedom of speech and kind of it'd be easy to kind of, or tempting now to associate that with, you know, more kind of the problematic right-wing stuff that we've seen recently of, you know, kind of people becoming much more potentially, you know, racist, fascistic, sexist with their communication, where, you know, they just kind of mutter it before. But actually, you know, I think we need to embrace the counterpoint of that as well. And like you say, that might be communicating things completely artistically, or kind of really liberating the way we express ourselves. And, you know, even if it's as simple as, I don't know, like dancing down the aisle of the supermarket, it's something. But I think with that kind of notion, you know, we can start challenging these status quos from the other end. You know, in some ways, Jane is a statement of, you know, why can't my imagination speak for itself? And I think that's important because, you know, when I'm writing lyrics, or, you know, when I'm looking to host, you know, when I'm hosting a radio show, when I'm potentially kind of writing prose, or I haven't done that in goodness knows how much time, because essentially my writing now is doctoral, unfortunately. But, you know, even with that doctoral writing, a lot of the, you know, there's so much structure still existing in all of that, that actually maybe it just takes a completely different person within me to kind of help liberate some of those structures. And actually, it's, in a musicianship sense, it's quite refreshing because, like I said, like Do the Obscure, it has its different angle, and I really enjoy that. And it's kind of it's a punk trumpet thing, apparently, that's trying to incorporate, you know, little bits of drum and bass and ska and all sorts of things that I've accumulated over the years. A lot of like indie and alternative stuff from the mid-noughties when I was starting to get my own CDs and that sort of thing, you know, all of that. And now when Jane kind of will hopefully, you know, start performing her own music, as well as her own poetry and that sort of stuff, you know, and I'm influenced by different poets as well. I'm not fully aware of what Jane's been influenced by, because that's almost a subconscious influence. So the way that her
and it's
sound,
hers, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not really yours. It's
exactly
hers.
So the way that that's going to come out, even though it's coming out my mouth, and at the moment, obviously, in the Spoils Collective, I'm dressing up as Jane but using Jack's voice because, you know, admittedly, the voice therapy that I want to do, that I know a lot of people who are going through transition as transgender will do, where you can kind of try and adjust your vocal pitches. Obviously, I've got to try and find a form of that I can do that still allows me to speak as Jack, but also kind of gives Jane her own distinctive voice and accent as well. That's not yet there. She's just kind of commandeering my day-to-day voice, essentially.
Because that's her choice, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So... and, with all the best will in the world, we're not constrained by structure, but we are constrained by time. And, kind of being able to do that process is going to be an elongated process, and it needs to be done right. So, it's another part of Jane's creation that's going to be there in the future.
It must be really exciting for you, and possibly a little nerve-wracking as well, because obviously you are giving her that space. Are you afraid that Jack might get completely lost to Jane at some point, or is that something that you think will never happen?
It's very unlikely, I think. So when I was doing my creative writing degree, one particular philosopher, I guess, that I hooked onto, with interest rather than any significance from early on, was Roland Barthes, who writes about the death of the author. That, when you produce a piece of work, a piece of writing, and you release it into the ether, then the author contained within that work dies, because the work is no longer your own. But I think pragmatically, quintessentially, on a real world level, that author is still there. Whether they're still alive at that point or they have been alive, you still know that author exists. So, as far as I perceive it, there is an element of rebirth and death in kind of Jane coming to pass, but she's not looking to fully take me over. It's not kind of like a parasitic sort of thing where Jane's going to occupy all of my time and then I'll fade away. I just think that as Jane becomes more and more autonomous in herself and kind of comes out into the world, then my role in constructing and narrating that will disappear over time.
Does it feel a bit like raising a child? Do you feel like almost like a loving parent bringing this person into reality and helping them to shape their life?
Surprisingly not. I was almost expecting it to, but again, and I think that's part of my learning process. I think, when I did somewhat think that way to begin with and kind of thinking, like I need to kind of guide Jane out into the world, naturally she approached that as kind of quite condescending. For all intents and purposes, when she was a voice in my head kind of proper, canonically she was my age. And, I guess has kind of lived as long as I have in one form or other, just kind of very much in the background. So it's almost
like a twin?
Yeah, I guess. It's kind of like bands that I've watched, on the television, like whether it's through Glastonbury or like different festivals, where over time, they'll start as, like a 3 or 4 piece, and then they'll want to do more ambitious things with their work. So they'll have like a mystery musician in the background who's playing an extra guitar or a keyboard. And I just spend my time watching like the fix on this other musician, being like, who is this? I want to know who your secret band member is. And I think like this is the justice to that, because, even if I'm not aware of it, there must have been an aspect where Jane has influenced me at some point. And again, sometimes that might be, if, potentially there's been a bit of an internal dissonance and that's made me act in a particular way. And obviously that's not the reason for all of my bad actions. I've done really stupid things as Jack, and I've got to take ownership for those and kind of recognize that. But I think, she's probably done me a lot of good as well, especially in taking a skeptical eye to norms and, kind of social constructs and that sort of thing. Even if it's just through that experience of, Jane holds remnants of when I was existing in a world that wasn't my own, but nobody else's own either. Because kind of growing up with autism, sometimes it would, unfortunately, it's a cliche. It would feel like I was growing up in an environment where I had kind of no knowledge or control over the conventions that were happening around me.
What advice would you give to other people, especially maybe those that are quite young, who are still in school, who are experiencing the same experiences as you? What advice would you like to give them about their experience and how they can sort of navigate themselves in a less challenging way?
I would certainly say from the outset, if listening to this inspires you, amazing. Like, that's more than what I could ever ask for. At the same time, please don't listen to this and then feel guilty or compelled if you don't want to open up straight away. It is, I think it'd be very easy for me to look back now, like as an autistic advocate, and be like, oh, why can't people be open about their autism? Look how many opportunities it's given me. I know that would be a very narrow lens, and an even narrower lens in the current cultural context for mental health concerns, like experiencing psychosis. I think do what almost none of us do, if you can, or at least contemplating it is something, which is giving yourself the gift of time. If your experiences make you feel unsafe and you need to block them away, then that's fine. I wouldn't ever kind of suggest putting yourself at risk in order to hear what's being said. At the same time, if you're one of those people who I think are grossly underrepresented, who just experience voices, whether that's external or internal, and there's no threats, there's no kind of one reason, they're just there, then actually the art of listening is something that we all need to do more. Like the art of listening is so fundamentally important to who we are, but we drown it out so much of our lives. And it might even be not necessarily listening to your voices, but listening to the world around you and listening to yourself and listening to how that world around you sinks in and how it makes you feel, and being completely honest.
I mean, that's just great advice for everybody, to be honest. I'm thinking about people, parents now, brothers, sisters, family members that may have a sibling or a child that has recently been diagnosed. What advice would you give to them on how to approach the situation and how to encourage and support their child or sibling in the best possible way?
When I asked my parents about, as I was growing up, about what they thought of me as a child, and, when we thought I was eccentric rather than autistic and all this sort of thing, they would say, we just thought you were growing up in a different way to your brother. And I think that's so important. It's not like, even though, like I've had fluctuating levels of inferiority complex, and sometimes it's been quite monumental in size, it's, I have to kind of remind myself, like, I've not grown up worse than anyone else, and I've not grown up better than anyone else. I've grown up differently. And they understood that and what growing up differently meant. That's so key, and I think that should be key for anyone. That actually, again, I could have reflected on my friendship with Will and kind of thought, I'm so different because of my autism. How did he put up with that? Or how did I manage to have such an amazing friendship kind of throughout that period? Or in the kind of loving relationship that I'm in now with my partner Catherine, like how does she deal with kind of various things? And it's just understanding that it's different. At the end of the day, it's just we are all developing at different stages in different ways, and if you approach it like that rather than like a potential shoehorning or whatever, or trying to fix things, then hopefully you'll only kind of end up in a good place, or at least a true place, until you find a good one.
Oh, that's fantastic advice, Jack, and very touching to hear, especially from your point of view as well. It's just been such a wonderful interview. I've learned a lot about you, but also a lot about myself in the process of listening to you. So thank you for all of your words of wisdom and just sharing your experience in general. Before we leave this podcast, can I give you a quick fire question round?
You absolutely may.
Fantastic. Okay, are you ready?
I've just swallowed another big gulp of tea, so I believe I
am. Okay. A book that inspired you and why?
It's called Mr. Pip, and I'm really going to quickly look up who wrote it. Lloyd Jones, there we go. So Mr. Pip, in a nutshell, is a teacher who's come over to a kind of like an island that they're not familiar with. I think they're the only white person on the island, and they're being kind of tasked there with teaching English, and they try and teach about Great Expectations, I believe, that Pip comes from, Dickens' novel. And it's about the experience of one of the children receiving that education and how they develop it into their own. And it kind of really stands out to me of how, we can kind of explore how we receive different areas of literature and fiction and how they become authentic onto our own, and how we can kind of appreciate the authenticity of previous author as well.
A thing that you would rescue from your home if you had to?
Oh, initially I would say the comics that I wrote, but I've already kind of pre-rescued them because before he passed away, I sent those on to Will. So they're kind of safely among his stuff, thankfully. Mm-hmm. I think, it's an obvious answer, I guess, but it probably would be the teddy bear that I had, I'm pretty sure, since birth. I think when I was much younger, and I would watch my brother playing computer games, and this was the kind of what I described potentially indulgently as the golden kind of PlayStation 1 era, where you have all your excellent brightly coloured characters like your Crash Bandicoot and your Spyro and your Rayman, that honestly I keep going back to play because I'm very stuck in my ways. But obviously I'd see him play those before I had a games console of my own, and I would get my cuddly teddy that was called Joey for some reason. He wasn't Australian, he was a polar bear. Don't know why he's called Joey. Going against kind of cultural appropriation, I guess, even for my age. But I would use him as my quote unquote, computer game character. And I do little sketches of maps, and I get him to kind of jump and fly across things in the living room or in the bath or wherever, and he'd have his own little adventures.
I still have my childhood teddy bears. I've got one called Dingles, who's an old woolen bear, and a pony called Scamp. So they're safely up in my attic as we speak, and will always be part of me. What do you cherish in your life at the moment?
I really cherish the moments of the people I meet. I'm sorry, that's a really wishy-washy answer, but I think so. I volunteer in a charity shop that kind of, in a sense, started as part of my master's project. I wanted to create a shop that autistic people could do work experience in and feel comfortable. But obviously, I couldn't go throughout lockdown, and when we were able to come back, it struck me in a way that I didn't realize that, even though, it was either kind of locals from to a point where it is, or, potentially complete strangers, people who aren't necessarily close to me, just kind of having conversations with them as they walk in the shop, and, kind of being, just kind of saying, how are you, and that sort of thing. It's struck me on such a bizarre level about how important that was, and that I just hadn't realised.
Song you absolutely must sing along to?
Oh, I've got to try and discern this between
narrow it down.
Yeah, the ones I must sing along to, and the ones I probably shouldn't. The one that kind of jumps into mind is Pioneers. It's a Block Party song.
If there was a zombie apocalypse, what would you use as a weapon, and where would you hide?
I don't see myself surviving very well a zombie apocalypse, to be quite honest. Maybe I'd use what's left of my cowardice as a weapon and hide somewhere very deep, honestly. Or I'd use my general ignorance around zombie films, which I must admit, kind of probably the focal one I've watched is Shaun of the Dead, and or possibly Zombieland at a push. I need comedy with zombie films, otherwise I can't deal with them that well, and I still get grossed out a little bit. But I like to hope that my lack of preconceptions about what zombies are going to be like would prepare me for most things.
That is probably the best answer I think I've ever heard on that question.
An open mind and cowardice. Those are my weapons.
Jak Whitfield, you get the solitary clap of joy. Hey!
Thank you so much.
I've got one final question for you before I let you go into your wonderful day. What advice would you like to give to the world right now as we come out of lockdown and we're all sort of putting our heads above the sand and we're starting to integrate again? What advice would you like to give to the world right now?
To completely go against any of my musical tastes and to quite take that, just have a little patience, honestly. I think, like even before lockdown, we've been through kind of a bit of a decade of pandemonium. And I think, whether it's been through literature, music, or people I speak to and that sort of thing, I think, there's been a lot to be angry about. And I think we could kind of roll on into this decade kind of feeling an intense sense of panic. I think this has kind of been not necessarily like an ending chapter, but like a benchmark, this pandemic, where worse things can happen and we can cope. But, we just kind of, I guess without being too zen, like this and my research and kind of really appreciating friends that I have while they're still around, I guess, and, kind of appreciating stuff in the past and how it changes has kind of given me this view of, stepping back and listening and responding without screaming, which is, I know, really ironic considering a lot of Do the Obscure is shouting. That's so important right now. Don't give anger and rage and hate the bait that it wants, and give it the silence it deserves. And let your creativity speak instead, I guess. Yeah, we don't need to be governed by the things which kind of suppress and control and aggravate us. And I guess that's a message from Jane as much as it is a message from me.
Thank you so much for just everything today. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. And I can't wait to get you back on the show at some point down the line to have further conversations with you, because I find you absolutely fascinating and a total joy.
Yeah, fingers crossed by that time, Jane will be being much more, Jane will have that platform, and she'll be able to come on and point out all the times that I've been stupid in this interview. Very much have her own voice and be able to say her own stuff.
I'm sure she will, and I can't wait for the day that I get to get her on the show, because she sounds like a fierce sister, that's for sure.
Absolutely. I hope so.
Before you leave, if people want to find out more about your radio show, about Jane, about you, about everything that you do, what are your social media handles? Where can they find you online? Good luck.
So I guess focal point to start would be my Instagram. So that's at Dude the Obscure Music, or one word. if you're interested in the Dude the Obscure stuff, you can find it on SoundCloud, again, /Dude the Obscure, I believe. There are 2 Dude the Obscures, but you'll be able to tell which one I am because I'm holding a crocodile puppet.
Of course.
We'll be able to find the Dude the Obscure show on Mixcloud under Omnium Radio. I think it's called Omnium CIC in Mixcloud. There's an amazing interview I do with Cat Savage there that you should absolutely check out. The Spoils Collective, we are on Bandcamp, I believe, at The Spoils Collective. I should say for Marion's sake, .bandcamp.com. So thespoilscollective.bandcamp.com. And Jane's stuff will be coming soon. I'm hoping to get her own account, her own bits and pieces very, very soon. So when that is around, I will very much signpost via Dude the Obscure and, with permission through the Spoils Collective.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jack. And we'll drop all of the links to all of the social media handles that you've mentioned in the show notes of this episode. So if you've forgotten or you haven't written them down in time, you know that they'll be in the show notes. So thank you so much for your time today, Jack. I've really appreciated it.
I really appreciate you having me on, and thank you.
I found this interview super fascinating, and it got me thinking a lot about how I present myself to others. I definitely have an online and stage persona that differs from my at-home persona. I guess online, like everyone, I present the best bits of my life, and on stage I become a louder party animal version of myself. But my other self, the one reserved for my family and to an extent this reflective part of the podcast, is definitely more introverted and energetically still. I think everyone, to some extent, has 2 sides or at least 2 voices within their head. Maybe right now you're driving or working and equally listening to me. Maybe your thoughts flit between work and this podcast, or maybe you are observing or thinking about the thought you're having as a result of listening to this right now. Our minds are deeply complex, and we have the gift of being this metacognitive creature. As artists, I think we are very in touch with this observational pondering. What I paint or write comes from a seemingly higher self. I definitely don't feel like the voice speaking through those endeavours. So maybe we all have a little Jane inside of us. They may not be as fully realised as Jack's Jane, but I think we can all relate to her on some level, regardless of whether we are artists or performers or not. I love that Jack is so open and authentic with his journey, that he is quite happy to smash the status quo and raise important questions about it on a daily basis. Through his PhD, his solo work and his collaborative art, Jack is expressing every part of himself. And now with Jane Unsuppressed, he gets to do that in such an original and beautiful way. Jack is unafraid to try new things. Maybe, as he mentioned earlier in the interview, this might be because growing up he had to find a different way to be in society. He didn't fit the mould from the get-go, and so has continually had to find the courage to remain himself in a world that isn't made for those that stand out. And thank God, for Jack is one of the most interesting and thought-evoking artists in the area. He's a punk trumpeter, for starters. Jack's advice on learning to listen is both needed in the external world, but equally crucial in our inner worlds. It's so easy not to hear or engage fully. Our minds have approximately 50 thoughts per minute. Just let that sink in. 50 thoughts per minute. So actively listening is actually a pretty challenging thing to do. Yet how often do we listen to those voices in our head that tell us that we're not good enough, or our work is crap, or we're ugly, or too fat, or too young or old, etc.? We have a strong mind for listening and creating voices, and we have to choose whether we listen to them fully or not. A student of mine recently said that when she's listening to her inner critic, she imagines a 5-year-old version of herself standing in front of her and has her critic say whatever it is that it's saying to her, her inner child. I thought this was incredibly touching and a really good way to let those thoughts really sink in. The next day, I thought about this as another student said she hated the sound of her voice. So I gently asked her to imagine that little inner child of hers that so desperately wanted to sing, to stand in front of her in her mind and had her say, "I hate your voice," to her. She didn't need to say it before the realization and weight of what she was internally listening to every time she said it kicked in. Outside or inside, honing our listening skills, hearing what's actually being said and finding the courage to address that, whether that be verbally or non-verbally, creatively or constructively, our biggest gift to this world and ourselves could be just to listen. It could be to accept ourselves fully, voices and personalities galore when other people want to shut that down. It could be to express our imagination when someone or something would rather you weren't different to them or the world. It could be that you take that box you're supposed to fit inside and instead stand upon it and sing, dance, and shout louder. Whatever you believe your biggest gift is, try and find the courage to utilize it. And who knows, maybe your inner Jane may wish to join you. As creatives, the muses of life and the alchemists of dreams, it's time to let your imagination flow unhindered. You are a lightning rod directly to the divine source in a storm of warring egos. It is your destiny to brighten the dull grey sky. As Dr. Wayne Dyer once said, "I am thankful to all of those who said no. It is because of them that I did it myself." Next time on the show, we speak to illustrator and Instagram artivist Rosie Johnson on making a statement without saying a word. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the show. If you have a spare moment now, please like, subscribe, and tell me your thoughts in a review on Apple Podcasts, which will really help other people like yourself to find the show. Of course, you can also share the show with your friends by following us at the Brave Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, or on Twitter at Moment Brave, or just follow the Linktree on all of our social media platforms. It's been so wonderful to have you all here with me again. Please get in touch with your own stories, and remember, your brave moment starts now.